Good evening and welcome to this Power Hour event with Claire Hanna MP. My name is Kezia Dugdale and I'm the Director of the John Smith Centre at the University of Glasgow, and I'm also going to be your host for the next 60 minutes. Our mission here at the John Smith Centre is to make the positive case for politics and public service. And we do that in three ways: through research, studying the relationship between the public and their politicians, through our various internship and development programmes designed to break down the barriers people face accessing public life, and also through advocacy with events like these Power Hours. This is the 15th official Power Hour we've hosted and the second devoted to the theme of women in public life, which is our theme throughout 2023. Each event is recorded and available to watch again on our website in full or with edited highlights. During each session, we talk to our guests about their early lives, what shaped them, their current work, and their hopes and fears for the future. You too can shape that conversation though by asking your own questions of our guests via the Q&A box at the foot of the screen. They'll come through to our team here at the John Smith Centre and we'll combine them with those submitted in advance, putting as many as we possibly can to Claire in the time that we have together. So welcome, Claire. You represent the Westminster constituency of Belfast South in the House of Commons, where you join us from this evening. We're going to find out how you got there in a moment or two, but let's start with your early years. What were you like at school?
I was fairly happy, but probably pretty unmemorable. I mean, I was mid-table academically and had a good wee bunch of pals, but I wouldn't. It's fair to say have been one of the cool kids. But you know, I've largely positive memories. I think, like a lot of people, maybe in my mid-teens, I sort of drifted away from learning and academics. I was pretty convinced I knew everything, and I ended up taking about 10 years out just after doing not very well in my A-levels, and didn't go back to university until I did part-time in my late 20s. But I've broadly positive memories of school.
And who inspired you? Who guided your choices at that time?
You do just kind of pick up the ideas that are lying around. I mean, I was just leaving school around the time of the Good Friday Agreement, and that was a really optimistic time in Belfast. There was a lot of possibility and hope in the air. There was a lot of change and investment and development. As I say, I wanted to kind of get on and do things, and I kind of did a bit of traveling and a few jobs in bars and stuff around those years, and then I hit on a fairly interesting job in when I was about 20. I was in the BBC for a while and then went into comic relief, and I just had interesting work, and it was an exciting time. But I was involved kind of in the periphery with the SDLP. My folks were involved, and then I was briefly living in Dublin and got involved with the Labour Party there. And I suppose that the giants of Irish politics in terms of Hume and Mallon and others were big influences. But I suppose in my early 20s, I suppose more left-wing politics, which had kind of been starved out of existence during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, started to shape my thinking a wee bit more.
People that aren't steeped in kind of Northern Irish politics might not know that you come from a well-known political family. I'm just wondering, was it kind of expected of you that you would eventually end up in politics?
No, it really wasn't, and I don't know what the definition of dynasty is, but there's only been two of us, my mum and then me. But no, I mean, my parents were the type of people who were political because of the context they were in. My dad was a student at the time of the civil rights movement and got involved with that, and was a very early member of the SDLP. And my mum was a nurse, and she nursed in wards in Belfast during the Troubles. And I remember her telling me she joined the SDLP after work, and she was a ward sister in the Mater Hospital the day of Bloody Friday when dozens of bombs were set off across the city, and it was in complete chaos. And people like John Hume were around and speaking at meetings, so they got involved then. Although they moved to the south in the mid-70s for about 10 years, where me and all my siblings were born, and then as a vocation, my dad took a job with the SDLP in the late 80s. Sometimes we question him about why he moved 4 children under 10 from peaceful rural Galway into Belfast in the mid 80s. But no, it wasn't expected. I'm the youngest of 4. My oldest sister is fairly political. She's been in the States for the last sort of 25 years, and she'd be involved, you know, with the Democrats locally, not just as I suppose not a hobby, but she's not actively political. But my other two siblings have very little interest. Unfortunately for them, they get roped in because of me, but they are mainly my best poster and my best babysitter during campaigns. But no, there wasn't really an expectation at all. If anything, I think my mum in particular, at many points, you know, up to and around elections, would caution me if this was really something that I wanted to pursue. But they've been really supportive and a brilliant guide, and just really good judges for some of the thorny problems you hit.
Well, maybe pick up on some of that and a little bit about some of the barriers that women in particular face accessing public life, and the bigger question of whether they would want to in the current political climate a bit further on in the time that we've got together. But I just want to track back to those early years for a little bit longer. You mentioned right at the start there that you returned to education in your 20s, and that took you to university. I guess not so much now, but perhaps then that was quite an unusual story. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, as I say, just when I was leaving school, I knew I just wasn't ready to. There wasn't anything I particularly wanted to do. I didn't have a very clear set of a career, and I was enjoying. I was just enjoying life, I suppose, and as I say, had some interest in work and interest in opportunities at the time. But you do. I mean, I was working for an NGO called Concern in my mid to late 20s, and it wasn't really even for career reasons. I just was becoming more interested in structures and systems, and probably wanted to put a bit of shape on the things, the things where my mind was going. So yeah, it probably was. I did my primary degree with the Open University, and that's a division bell, a voting bell going in the background, by the way. The building's not on fire or anything, but so I did my degree in international relations with the Open University, an organization I'm just a tremendous admirer of, a real social democratic achievement, actually, that just, you know, opens up third level education to so many people. And then a couple of years after that, I did a master's at Queen's University. Again, just I like projects, I suppose, and I was interested. Always found the course material really interesting. But I suppose it isn't the normal pathway, but I think it's actually a pathway that we should you know, let people know is there. I think university at 18 is a great thing to do, and I know, you know, a lot of my pals who went that way really enjoyed it, but it's not the only way. And by the time I did knuckle down, I was ready to learn. I was interested in doing it, and you probably have a bit of onboard knowledge that helps you through some of the material as well.
I think it's so comforting for people to hear that story, because I think there's always an expectation when you look at figures like yourself that have achieved as much as you have, and you've been a councillor, you've been a member of the Legislative Assembly in Northern Ireland, and now you're an MP, that you must have always wanted to do that from day one. You must have known exactly what you wanted to do when you went to uni at 18 and had a career path marked out for you. And to hear that it's not always like that, and that things evolve as time moves on and your own circumstances change, is of great comfort, we know, to students that are tuning into this, and to a wider group of people. You talked also there about your interest in international development, and before we get stuck into the Northern Irish politics, I just wanted to ask you for a second about that. You work for Comic Relief. That sounds like a great job. What did that involve?
I did work for Comic Relief. I was project manager on their Red Nose campaigns in, I think, 2003 and 2005, which probably really dates me for Northern Ireland. I'd been working in the BBC doing some kind of new media stuff then, and kind of fluked into that job. And I'd always, I suppose, just had a sense of solidarity and interest in overseas development. But that was a really useful way. It was a kind of a promotion and fundraising focus, but obviously you got to be quite intimately familiar with the projects that Comic Relief were funding overseas and within Northern Ireland, actually, and loads of community partners there. But yeah, it definitely it kind of lit a bit of a fire in me. And then after that, it was around the time if people remember, in 2005, the Make Poverty History campaign came after that, and I got quite involved with it, with a number of voluntary groups, you know, just campaigning for some, and there was real progress made around, you know, just getting a global consensus on some of those issues. And then I started working for Concern Worldwide after that, and I ended up, I went in as a project manager for an exhibition for 6 months, and ended up squatting the role, different jobs for about 10 years. But I mean, especially somewhere like Northern Ireland, it's a really it's a good leveler. It's great for perspective. It's an incredible way to understand the challenges of delivering public services in unstable environments, and in many ways, you know, we don't know we're born, even with all the challenges and post-conflict issues that Northern Ireland was experiencing. But yeah, I learned an incredible amount. I mean, it was mostly Belfast based, but I did have a few short-term postings in Zambia for a while, and Bangladesh and Haiti, and I just experiences that will always, I suppose, put a balance on the things and the challenges I meet in this part of my working life.
You talk about 2003, 2005. I mean, they were years when you had a Labour government across the whole of the United Kingdom, and you know, the then Prime Minister Tony Blair, the Chancellor Gordon Brown, are pouring hundreds of millions of pounds into international development spending. Then you've got Make Poverty History, which leads to a broader commitment to spend 0.7% of GDP on international aid. Fast forward 15 years, and the political climate's very different now in terms of attitudes towards spending overseas, particularly on aid. How do you reflect on that? What changed? Why is it so different now?
Yeah, I think in many ways people's horizons and worldviews have got a lot smaller over the last few years, and the political climate that we're operating in. I mean, apart from anything else, apart from, even if you're not some